This is the Awful Announcing Podcast. Here's your host, Brandon Contes.
Do you think that Pat is reaching it all by assuming that Norby was leaking ratings and information and attempting to sabotage his show? Like, is that something that was surprising at all to hear him jump to that conclusion?
No, it wasn't surprising because there were certain narratives, when Michael Smith and I, when we were hosting The Six, I mean, we knew when Norby took over our show, he didn't really want us to be the anchors. That, had he had a chance to go back in the DeLorean, he never would have chosen us to host the 6 o'clock show. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have had a successful show in spite of us not being his first choice. But I do think us not being his first choice, or being a choice, I should say, I think that hurt. I mean, it really did. And I don't think, while there was certainly a level of professional respect, I do think the narratives around our show, he didn't help to kill those. And I don't know how much he had to do with creating them, but I can say that, I certainly had my suspicions, especially when it came to certain narratives that our show was too political, and there were certain decisions he made. I wrote about it in, my memoirs. Like, we had the personality wall behind us that used to be kind of a signature component of our set. And I already knew the picture that bothered him was probably the picture, especially given the climate, was the picture that Mike and I both took with President Obama, who was a fan of our show. And we had that on display every day, and they made us take all that down. And he was the one who engineered doing that. And, other things that got back to us about what he said about us in meetings and meeting with other people, we didn't appreciate it. And so when Pat McAfee talked about how narratives are spun about his show and the sabotage, when I tweeted, I can relate. That's what I was talking about. Because people got this idea that our show wasn't about sports, when 99.9% of the time we talked about sports. Sure. We didn't talk about politics. We didn't talk about, we weren't opening the show talking about immigration reform, seeing where things turn. I was like, shit, I wish we would have, right? I was like, maybe we should have started off the top of the show, talking about reparations. I don't know. I think maybe that might have worked. But yeah, I mean, we felt really undermined at a lot of different points. All of that was not on Norby for sure, but I don't think he helped, and I don't think he stopped it. And so I definitely could understand why Pat McAfee would immediately point to him as being somebody, knowing that he wasn't a fan, knowing, that maybe some things were said internally that we're not privy to that probably got back to Pat McAfee. And that's probably why he said what he said.
How was working with Max Kellerman?
Good, man. Max is fun. Max is, working with Max is like anybody else, right? You try to get a feel for him. I knew Max, but I never worked with him. It was fun. It was interesting because he had his own dynamics and stuff like that. He never worked in the 3-man booth before and on radio, and he was used to working by himself in radio most of the time. And so it just was different. But because I knew Max from LA, it was fine. I mean, it was fine for me. I mean, at times you get frustrated with all your co-hosts, but for the most part, Max was cool.
Have you spoken to Max since you guys left the radio show? Because like Williams is still on ESPN, you're at Fox, but Max hasn't done anything.
Yeah, no, I talked to him, but we didn't discuss where the landing spots are, nothing like that.
I mean, what we're seeing right now is the dawn of a dynasty. And I tweeted that out after the AFC Championship game on Sunday and got the usual pushback one would see in mentions where people think that I don't know what I'm talking about, ranging from that to, looking past the nuance of something I threw out in 280 characters. But you can't say that a team is dynastic with just one Super Bowl. Now, last year they got 2. And you could start to see that the Chiefs this year, though, were less than than either of their two Super Bowl winning teams, one with Tyreek Hill on it, one last year without him, but they were also a team that looked Super Bowl worthy for much of the year. This year, they didn't. And for them to come back and maybe go back to back, first of all, defend their title by going on the road in back-to-back weeks to knock off the 2-1 seeds above them in the AFC to regain their dominance and supremacy in the process. Maybe the most impressive run we've seen from Mahomes and Reed and Kelsey and everyone together over the first 6 years of him being a starter. And they have an air of invincibility about them right now. So this is the wrong time, it does appear, to be a quarterback in the AFC. Joe Burrow can raise his hand and say there was that one time when he was healthy and did beat Mahomes, and everyone else is retired. And I just called Tom Brady everyone else. Those are the only quarterbacks to have beaten Patrick Mahomes in a playoff. That's it. Brady twice for two different teams and Burrow. So this is kind of the wrong time to be in the AFC. In the same time, it was potentially the wrong time to be a superstar in the NBA while Jordan was playing, or a professional player when Tiger was at his zenith. We potentially are looking at that right now.
3 years later, it's Fox's first NASCAR Cup points race. You're on the call, and of course, that is the day of the fatal crash for Dale Earnhardt Sr. Was that the hardest day of your career?
It was one of them. It was certainly one of them. We'd been in this position before, on radio, and on TV, of having. I mean, Hemingway said there's only three real sports, where man exposes himself to incredible danger to try to achieve amazing rewards. Mountain climbing, bullfighting, auto racing. We know the risks. We all accept the risks. And every driver out there says it can't happen to me. And then it happened to Earnhardt. Well, in the moment, we had no confirmation, no information at all from the accident scene or from NASCAR or from the Speedway. They went completely dark on us. We knew something bad had happened. We knew, and I knew from various experiences, that either Earnhardt, on the one hand, could have been superficially injured and had a bleeding wound and knocked unconscious. And we knew, on the other hand, this could be very serious, and had to strike a tone that was cautious yet hopeful. Because as our longtime producer Barry Landis always said, at that point, you're working for the family, and you're working for the friends of that driver, and you're trying to make this all work and make sense of it all. What I knew in my gut was that here's a driver who at one point flipped down the back straightaway, got out of his car, says, I think it'll run, jumps back in it, gets a push start, comes back to the pits, they tape it up, and he finishes the race. I knew if there was any possible way, Dale Earnhardt would have climbed in the driver's seat of that ambulance himself and driven it to victory lane to congratulate Michael Waltrip winning the race in his car, with Dale Jr. finishing second. So we pretty well assumed the gravity of what was going on, but we had no real information to go by. That made it more difficult to properly frame the moment. And we went off the air with congratulations to Michael Waltrip and prayers for Dale Earnhardt, because that was all we could do. And I think that was the most difficult part of it. And NASCAR, like other sports, like the NFL found out a year or so ago, that they don't have a plan for this. And informing their TV partners is not part of their plan, which is to get through the event and get through the calamity and make the best sense of it as possible. So we're on our own, and we're kind of flying without a net there, and trying to do the best we can for the family, the friends, the viewers, and the sport. It is both difficult, painful, and an incredible challenge. And I hope that day we did it well enough.
Yeah, how do you balance those emotions? Because, like you said, Michael Waltrip won the race. You have his brother Dale on the broadcast. It's an exciting finish. It's a great storyline, but that uncertainty with Dale Sr. How do you balance that? Do you just trust your gut in that moment?
We all did. Larry McReynolds, Darrell Waltrip, and I. Darrell would go, "Oh, Mikey's won the race," and then he turns, he goes, "Gosh, I hope Dale's okay." And during the break, I assured him, "Okay, we'll wait for word, and hopefully it's positive." But I really think at that point, your ability as a news hawk kicks in, and it's all right. Tell the story, get it right. Don't speculate, but let people know what you're seeing, what you're feeling, what you're thinking. But be guarded until you have concrete information. That's what we're trained to do. And then the emotions get to you of what could possibly have happened there and how it could have been caused and who, if anyone, was at fault. And that becomes difficult. You just have to rise above that and stay with the story and help it along as the story develops. It's not fun, but it's a big part of what we have to do sometimes.
Do you know if Dale Jr. was interviewed after the race there on the track, or was he immediately ushered away from any media responsibilities to get an update on his father?
My recollection was that he went to victory lane to congratulate Michael, and that someone whispered in his ear, and he was ushered away after that. But I'd have to look at the tape to guarantee.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm just curious.
Michael Waltrip, in his book, which I think is titled "In the Blink of an Eye," is that right? Yes, says that Ken Schrader came to victory lane, and Michael asked him, "How's Dale?" Because Michael knew that Dale had crashed. He had been told. And Schrader told him, "It's not good." Michael went, "Okay," and did what he had to do to complete all of his commitments there. But yeah, very, very difficult day. Probably the hardest in motorsports in a long, long time, because after that, everybody started questioning everything, because they knew if it could happen to Dale, it could happen to anybody.
Right.
In the aftermath of that, we've had tremendous advances in driver safety, in the driver compartment, in NASCAR, which previously left driver safety up to the driver, finally taking a leadership role in the development of safer cars and safer barriers around the racetrack, so that the sport we have today is way, way safer than the sport that Dale raced in.
How important has Caitlin Clark been to the growth of women's college basketball, or is it even possible that her importance is overstated because it is the sport that's growing and it's not just one individual?
I don't think her importance is overstated. I think she's a singular force like we've never seen before in the women's game, in particular in the women's college game. And we've had great players. We just haven't had this mix of a player who does something we've never seen before in the women's college game in terms of the logo threes. Every time the stakes raise and it feels like, oh, geez, there's got to be a lot of pressure on this kid, a lot of pressure. She meets the moment. And she does so many other things that are so exciting. Like my favorite part of her game is her passing. She is an incredible passer, and dynamic and has the right personality and all of that. But and yes, the rest of the women's game is incredible. Like I can't wait till this summer when hopefully the ratings translate to a degree to the WNBA, because people I think who haven't watched it before are really going to be kind of blown away at the level that these women play at. And yes, and it's there in college too. And we've seen, I think Doug Feinberg from the AP was the one who kind of wrote, there have been ticket selling teams where, because of what's written on the front of the jersey, whether it's UConn or Tennessee or South Carolina, have sold tickets on the road. But this is the first time, as he phrased that it's been the name on the back of the jersey that's really driven ticket sales and eyeballs on the game. So she's been a singular force and has come along right at the perfect moment.
I'm always curious with and I point to Howard Stern for this fact, the fact that Howard Stern had a relationship with Donald Trump before he was president, and then now has loathed Trump since he was president. Did you have any relationship with Trump prior to him being president?
Yes, I did. We crossed paths a number of times in the 80s, I guess, and 90s. He was always very kind, if that's the right word. He was flattering in the things he said. He told me he was a big fan of mine. Every time I saw him was at a sports-related event. And then here's an interesting story. I think I told this once on the radio on KMOX in St. Louis, my old station. Sometime, I don't know, close to 15 years ago, Joe Torre had a charity golf tournament at one of Trump's courses north of New York City. And at the end of the event, it's one of those events where people pay a lot of money to play golf with Derek Jeter or then Yogi Berra, whoever. And that I was the MC of the banquet afterwards, and they were auctioning items off. And one of the items was a year's membership at Trump National, and nobody bid. And so Joe Torre says, "Hey, Bob, you should play more golf. Why don't you jump in here?" And I knew that was the cue just to start the bidding. So I said, okay, 10 grand. Now, you knew that was a low bid, given what it costs to really join. But nobody bid. It was crickets after that. And so it looked like I'd bought it. And Trump was in the back of the room, and Trump said, "Oh, no. For my friend Bob Costas, it's a lifetime membership." Now, at this point, Trump is just the host of the Celebrity Apprentice. He's just kind of a tabloid figure around New York. Not necessarily the kind of guy I'd pal around with, but it's harmless, right? So I went to his course with friends probably a half dozen times in the ensuing year. And the first time I went there, I walked in the clubhouse, and there was a locker on a gold plate with my name over on a gold plate over the locker with my name on it, in between Bill Clinton and Tom Brady. And they treated me royally. All of his courses and properties are immaculate. They're, it's very nice to play. And one time I was playing on a Sunday afternoon with my son Keith, and here comes a cart across the fairway, breaking every rule. But as he gets closer, I realize he can break any rule he wants. It's his course. It's Trump with a photographer. And Trump says, "Bob, you and I are the only two people keeping NBC afloat. The Apprentice is number one, and Sunday Night Football is number two." And I say, "Well, Donald, I think Sunday Night Football would do fine without me, but congratulations on The Apprentice." I later checked, and, this is the least of his falsehoods. This is just an exaggeration and, general Trump BS. But at that point, The Apprentice was right on the cusp of the top 10. It certainly wasn't number one. And Sunday Night Football was number one, but who cares? Big deal. So he had his photographer take a picture, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so it's all fine. From the moment he descended the escalator in 2015, I knew this man was not fit to be president of the United States. A lot of people say, "Oh, never Trumpers," as if they had a closed mind about him. Like, oh, they just hated him from the start. Anyone who saw him descend that escalator and said this guy isn't fit to be president has been proven right 1,000 times over. So I've never set foot at that country club again. I've never had anything to do with anything Trump related. I have no idea what they did with my clubs.
Do you know if that gold plate is still there?
I would suspect it's not, but I don't really have that much curiosity about it. So had I crossed paths with Trump? Yeah. And until he entered politics, by the way, and his first utterance was a racist lie or a racist trope about Barack Obama's birth certificate. And the minute he began doing what he did, which is to debase our political and civic culture and to normalize abhorrent and dishonest behavior, this should not be a matter of party politics. It should be a matter of simple respect for what once were common principles. So at that point, I was done with him.
Was the decision to leave ESPN, was that mostly Dan's decision, or were you part of those conversations?
Very good question, Brandon. Was that Dan's? No, it was Dan's decision. I mean, listen, when they let Chris Cody go, anyone who knows Dan, Greg is his best friend. I mean, it's certainly not me. Greg Cody is his best friend. That's why he's on every Tuesday. Why else would we put that lunatic on? I'm joking. I love him. We love him. Our audience loves him. He fits our show perfectly. I want to say Dan might be the godfather of Chris Cody. I'm not 100% sure on that, okay? But I know they're very close.
Yeah.
So when they let Chris Cody go, ESPN did. I think everyone on our show had an idea what was coming next. So whether or not I spoke to him doesn't really matter. I kind of saw where it was going. And so, yeah, that decision mostly came from Le Batard.
And were you comfortable with that decision? Did you have faith in the decision to leave a brand as big as ESPN?
There was an excitement of not knowing what was on the other side. But I was nervous. Like, I really enjoyed being at ESPN. I've talked about this with Dan. Like, I really enjoyed being there. For me, when I got into the business, it was WFAN or ESPN. Like, that was the goal for me. And I got to ESPN. We got to ESPN. We got there together. And I'm not an idiot. I don't get there without Dan. So,
yeah.
And I realized that. I would have liked, I'll be perfectly honest with you, I could have stayed at ESPN for the rest of my life. So I was nervous, and I felt like I was growing at ESPN, and some good things were happening. So I was nervous only because I wasn't armed with the information that Dan was armed with. So I was definitely nervous. But the nervousness and the not knowing what was next kind of, once I got past not being at ESPN, it got me excited. Like, okay, what's going to be next? Dan wouldn't do this unless, we had a plan and all that. I would have liked to have been more involved in those conversations. I wasn't, but we've moved on,
So how did you get to FS1 then at that point? Because, I mean, Houston it's a much bigger market than Kansas City, but it's not like, I don't know. It doesn't strike me as a place that has a super passionate sports radio audience. Like,
no, it doesn't.
You're not doing double digits in ratings in Houston.
No. I mean, it's the fourth biggest market in America, but it's not the fourth best sports market.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. And it's kind of directly correlated. The colder your city, the better the sports radio ratings. And you know what I mean? Like Miami, Houston, Dallas is the outlier. Dallas has huge numbers, but LA's, those places. Meanwhile, Philly, Boston, Cleveland, Kansas City, New York, those places do really well. So that it is a long, kind of complicated story. I'll just tell the short version of it. I had done some fill-in stuff on Fox Sports Radio. It was 2016. My wife's from California. I wanted to be she's from Sacramento, but I wanted to be in California. And I went and pitched on my own to the head of ESPN LA and the heads of Fox Sports Radio, which is based in LA, but also has a big flagship in LA. Like, hey, I should have a show. And ESPN Radio, the guy there was super nice. Max Kellerman was nice to me. He was, doing a show there, and I had known him a little bit, but they didn't have any openings. Fox Sports Radio potentially did, but they were getting ready to announce that Colin, Colin hadn't yet come over yet.
Yeah.
And they wanted to do more stuff kind of hand in glove with FS1. And so they were open, I think, to hiring me, but they wanted to see, I think if they hired me, was there a chance my show would get simulcast, because they knew they were about to do a simulcast with Colin. And I ended up meeting with the then head of FS1, Jamie Horowitz, just trying to get him to sign off on Fox Sports Radio hiring me. And, like I said, I'll give the short version of it. The short version of it is, at the end of the meeting, he was like, why have you not tried to get me to hire you? I was like, because I don't do TV, I do radio. And he was like, I think you could do TV. And then I met with the guy who's now my boss, Charlie Dixon. He and I bonded over the fact that I had been on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire as a kid and won $50,000. And I ended up auditioning 9 times, flying out to LA, doing a show, going back to Houston. And then around the Super Bowl, so I guess this would be January of 2016, ESPN offered me a job and FS1 offered me a job. And through the great wisdom and advice of my wife, I went with FS1, and it's been, one of the best decisions I ever made.
ESPN's offer was for radio or TV?
ESPN's offer was it initially was an unknown radio show local in Los Angeles with weekly television appearances. Probably my guess is around the horns, something like that. They then at the very end told me what the radio show would be in LA, and I don't remember who had it then, so I'm not going to say what time slot, but a major time slot in LA. And it's so funny how life works. I accepted the offer from FS1 on a Tuesday night, and Wednesday morning, sent an email saying, I hadn't signed a contract, sent an email saying deal's done. And Wednesday morning, the ESPN folks called me and were like, hey, we finally have it locked down. We know exactly what show you'd be doing. And because of the show you'd be doing, it's actually a little more money than we thought. And I was, if I'm being totally honest, absolutely crushed, because my whole goal was to get a big time radio show in LA and get on TV a little bit. And I told the guy, and to his credit, he didn't push me on it. And I told him, I was like, listen, I accepted last night. And while I haven't signed anything, I told him yes. And I'm not going, you know what I mean? I'm not going to go back on that. It's not how I do business. And I thought I had made a grievous error. I tell you guys, I cried. I got off the phone and I cried. And I was like, why, just wait to send that email. Like, what'd you do? This was and I was nervous because I hadn't done TV.
Right.
And it's just funny how life works out. 6 months later, the fall of 16, I started April 20th, 2016. 6 months after that, ESPN did a massive round of layoffs. And I'm pretty confident I would have been one of those people. You know what I mean? Just because I had been brand new, whatever. Meanwhile, around that exact same time, FS1 was talking to me about moving to New York to front First Things First with Chris Carter. And you know what I mean? And it'll be the best thing for me. And I like the fact, I really like the fact, this is where, I don't know if ego is the right word, but I think it's really cool that of all the people on or who have been on FS1, the only two that are, basically, FS1 products are me and Joy. You know what I mean? Everyone, the former athletes are in a different category. You know what I mean? Almost like their original employer was the Philadelphia Eagles or whomever, but everyone else kind of came through the pipeline. Like I look at FS1 as the place that took a chance on me, that developed me. And so, and Joy got hired the same week I did. And Joy and I were in a very similar spot, which is, she was in from local radio in Miami. I was in from local radio in Houston, and both of our families had stayed. My wife and kids were in Houston. I was commuting on the weekends. Joy's family was in Miami. She was commuting when she could. And she and I both were out there like, I guess we're going to try this thing out. And so, and she's one of my favorite people. And so I just think, that's been a long time. What's that been? 8 years?
Yeah.
8 years. This is the longest I've ever worked anywhere. So yeah, it's great.
I believe you were the sixth woman inducted to the NSMA Hall of Fame.
Yes.
And a few years ago, you were the third woman ever to be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Second on the broadcast side, the venerable Leslie Visser and myself. and then Shireen Williams on the, pardon me, on the Prince side.
Okay. How special was that?
Well, it was very surreal, to be honest with you, because it is not something I ever thought would happen. And I'm not just sitting here being, oh my God, I failed the test and I got an A. Here's the reason why. I've taken on the NFL a lot in my career. Stories ranging from domestic violence to painkiller abuse to the use of marijuana to the one story that when for Real Sports that I did that rankled certain people at the NFL more than any other was a story I did on the abuse of cheerleaders by their teams. And I got a call from somebody at the NFL and they go, well, why don't you do this? And why don't you look into this? And I go, here's the deal. Pay your friggin' cheerleaders and we don't even have to be doing this story. So I did things like that because my obligation as a journalist is to capture reality and present what these issues are. And so I never thought that I would get that call because I always felt if my work's going to speak for itself, my work has not always been the most positive for the National Football League. So that made it even more special. But I'm waiting on the side of the stage to be introduced, and they're playing my piece that the wonderful Robin Roberts narrated, and it's like a career retrospective. So they have the Olympics in there, and they have ESPN in there, and they have Real Sports in there, and they use a clip from my story on marijuana use on the NFL, where Nate Jackson, former player, is talking about the efficacy of marijuana, and yes, he believes that it really has pain-killing properties. And the guy next to me on the stage goes, oh, well, I don't know that we've ever heard the word, I don't know that we've heard marijuana discussed at the Hall of Fame. And I couldn't resist, Brandon. I turned to him and I go, I'm in the Hall of Fame now. It's that moment where it's like, first of all, I'm going in and you can't stop me. But I was proud that with the body of work that I've done, that I was selected for that reason and not for political reason. And certainly not because everything that I've done has always been, flowers and roses and chocolates for the NFL. I've tried to do my job and report on the league, every league and every subject as fairly as possible.
What was your reaction the first time Aaron Rodgers called you out publicly?
I was in the ESPN green room and I was in between shows. So it was part of the car wash. And essentially what we were doing that day was Adam and I were taking turns popping on shows. So at that time, SportsCenter was on the air and I was scheduled to go on. And Aaron went on Pat McAfee. And that was the first time he addressed my report that he had a wish list of players that he gave the New York Jets, which we all knew was true and obviously turned out to be true. Because you saw who they signed. Right. And I remember Pat asking him the question about the wish list, and everyone in the green room was Shefty, Orlovsky, it was just producers. People were just popping their head in, and I think it was Orlovsky. He was like, here we go. And I'm like, oh gosh, what's he going to say? Because he is an incredible quarterback, and anything he says, people are going to just believe. And he said, I think he said he didn't know my name. I think he was like Diana, whatever her name is, and whatever he said. And so in the moment, I remember feeling defensive. I remember going, oh, I'm going on TV. I'm going on SportsCenter in 2 minutes. I'm going to light him up. I'm going to drop even more names that I had on his list. I'm thinking I'm going to go punch him right in the gut. And I'm sitting on the set and Sage Steele is next to me. And the other anchor is in the middle of a read and he's doing something. And Sage looks at me and I think she could see on my face that I was fired up. And she just immediately went into mentor, big sister mode and was like, nope, class. And I was like, okay, stick to your facts, give your information. It's about the story, not you. Okay. Anchor tosses to Sage. She says, all right, Diana, Aaron Rodgers just went on Pat McAfee. He denies that there was a wish list. What do you know? And I just went back to reporter version of me and just said, well, Sage, here's what I know. Here's what I can share with the viewer. And I saw Sage recently and I thanked her for that moment. It was a really good lesson that it's not personal and you can't let it ever get that far, even though you could feel maybe forms of embarrassment, or I just remember not wanting the attention in that moment. I just wanted to report the story.
Yeah.
So I'm very grateful that I had somebody there who was calm in the moment and saw this could be really bad if you don't act like a credible journalist right now. And so ever since then, I've handled the Rodgers situation the same way, which is I'm just going to share what I know. I know he doesn't like it. And I know he respects me because I had somebody from his camp tell me that. Like, you drive him crazy, but he thinks you're really good. So I'm at peace with it.
Since you mentioned that you didn't love the Trout Ohtani call, do you have a call, whether it's that one or another one that you would like to have back?
I would like to do Ohtani's 40-40 Grand Slam again. It's another one where I don't know that I did anything wrong. I didn't mess it up.
Yeah.
I wish I would have said his name within the call, just for that historical soundbite. I think that it probably required his name. But I went back and listened to it probably 15, 20 times trying to figure out how I could have done it a little better. I like to get a notepad out and write down, and I've been doing this since I was in Montgomery, write down what I said, and I don't know if workshop is the word, but nitpick it and find where I could have gotten rid of words, how I could have timed certain things better. Again, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't call him by the wrong name or say the wrong thing that happened, but I would like to be able to do that one again.
Is there anyone you lean on that you send audio to and ask them for feedback?
Yeah. Early in my career, it was all the time. I was probably a nuisance to people, just asking for critiques all the time. And these days for baseball, like Dan Shulman has been a big help to me. Sent him some tape. Gary Cohen has listened for me. I bug Wayne a lot.
Yeah.
Adam Amin is another guy who I've grown up with, and he was in my wedding as well with Wayne, and bug him for critiques and ideas. And it's not as much like it used to be when we were in the minors. It would be listen to this half inning and really break it down and give me all this stuff to work on. And it's not as much that anymore as it is one of us will hear one thing or another that we point out. And it's like that one little tweak or that one little idea that can help you improve a little bit. So, and then I try to listen to myself too. Every couple of weeks, I'll go back. It used to be in Montgomery, I'd listen to every game before I had kids and had more time to do whatever I wanted.
Yeah.
But these days, I'll go back and listen every couple of weeks with a pad and a pen out and take down notes that I'll then physically take with me into the booth for the next couple of weeks of games as reminders for things I want to work on. When it comes to NFL, I do listen to every game because you got a whole week between them. So I do the same thing where I'll take notes. The Steelers-Falcons game, I'll watch back and be hard on myself and take notes, and I'll have those going into week 2 for Colts and Packers to hopefully improve a little bit.
You mentioned when you fell in love with boxing at a young age. It was still once you got into broadcasting, it was a few years before you started announcing boxing, correct?
Do you know this story?
No.
So, Cosell did boxing at ABC, and Barry Tompkins did boxing at HBO. And by the time you get to 1987, and I've been at ABC for 13 years in 1987, I had never been anywhere near a boxing match. To do so would have incurred the ire of Howard Cosell, and that was the last thing you wanted to do. And then the network was sold, pretty much like HBO. Network was sold, and the new entity that bought the network was a stations ownership group named Capital Cities. And they wanted to put their stamp on particularly the owned stations division. And Roone Arledge was at that time running two divisions, news and sports. So Capital Cities went to Roone and said, doesn't make any sense for one man to be running both news and sports. Pick one. And he intelligently, for his legacy, chose chose news. So now they took the guy who had been running stations, a man named Dennis Swanson, and moved him over to run sports. And Swanson arrived at ABC Sports with one basic predilection, which was who is Jim Lampley and why are we paying him all this money? So within the first 2 or 3 weeks of his tenure at ABC Sports, Swanson made clear to my agent that he was going to do everything possible to get me to walk away from my existing contract, and he was going to do nothing to further advance and elevate my career. And gradually over the course of the next few months, he did a variety of things that made that very clear. But the one unusual thing he did was to, in the wake of Cosell's departure, to assign me to boxing. He thought that given my personality type, my background, the way that I dressed, all the things that he observed about me, he thought there was no way in the world that Jim Lampley will understand boxing or that boxing will accept him. So he was assigning me to boxing for the purpose of trying to force me out of ABC Sports. He also didn't realize that the division had just recently signed a get acquainted, look-see contract with a 19-year-old heavyweight from New York whose name was Mike Tyson. And so the very first fight I ever called on ABC Sports, February of 1987, was Mike Tyson versus Jesse Ferguson. And it was a spectacular showing by Mike. He obliterated Jesse's nose in the 4th or 5th round. There was blood all over the ring. And in the post-fight interview with the expert commentator, an executive named Alex Wallow, who Swanson also was trying to get rid of, Alex asked Mike about the uppercut, and Mike said, Pat McAfee taught me that the purpose of the uppercut was to drive the nose bone into the brain. I was trying to drive his nose bone into his brain. I was standing at ringside thinking, look at what I've happened onto here. This is astonishing. This kid is not only going to be the number one quote machine in boxing, he's going to be the number one quote machine in sports. And within the next few weeks, they all began rolling out. Boxing is a hurt business. Everybody's got a plan until you hit them, et cetera, et cetera. And I was Tyson's early curator for the first few fights on ABC before I was forced to walk away. I took a job with CBS, doing local sports at KCBS TV in Los Angeles, doing NFL football, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually, not too long after that, HBO came to me and said, will you call our fights? They had signed a contract with Tyson. So that's really where my boxing career originated, was in the heart and mind of Dennis Swanson. How can I embarrass Jim Lampley and force him to walk away from ABC Sports? Oh, I'll assign him to boxing. Famous last words, right?
So you mentioned seeing Mike and Mike on in the training room at Notre Dame. Did you watch and listen to Mike and Mike before school? Like, were you paying attention to it regularly?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I always joked that it was the only thing Mom would let us listen to. She was the one that when Dad was there, she would drive us to school before I had my driver's license. But no, it was the background to our life. And I mean, listen, that show changed my family's life forever. There's no sugarcoating that. I mean, it was an incredible run and something that we were blessed to have a front row seat to for that long. But yeah, that's because I get the thing in public still now when people come up to me. I've been fortunate to do this for a while now, and I feel good about my career path. But I understand when people see me, by and large, they think of Dad. And so when most people see me out in public, especially men of a certain age, they're like, "Oh man, I loved your dad." Like, tell him I loved him on Mike and Mike for so long. And there's no real like easy answer for me to that because Dad's not there and someone's giving me a compliment about someone else. But it is just a reminder. And the thing I always say to them is, no, it was the same for me too. Like for these people that had that as the memory when, they had a moment with their parents or their children, or when they were going through the birth of a child, and Mike and Mike was this thing in the background for all these formative moments for so many people. I always tell them it was the same for me. This was the show that I grew up with, around, and in a lot of ways a part of, as a show that always made a point that they were going to talk about their families. That was the decision that Dad and Greenie made pretty early on in that show. And something we were well aware of is this was going to be a family show, and that part of their lives was, I think, a connective point that so many people that were fans of that show appreciated. But it also let us know that, hey, you're growing up in the fishbowl. The things that you do that are funny are going to make it on air, and that's going to be a part of what we talk about.
Was that ever uncomfortable for you?
Not then, because again, we didn't really know any better. It wasn't until years later, and especially as I started doing this as a profession, that I realized, it did kind of, change the way that I thought about relationships in my life, where I was conscious of, hey, are there certain people that are here because they actually like you versus here because of, hey, you've got the nice house, you've got the things that come with, having a dad that's on TV, people that are aware of that. And so I think it did make me aware too, in a way that I always talk about with young athletes coming up, because, playing at a place like Notre Dame, guys that play big time college sports or at any level, you're always told, hey, in most cases it's, hey, there's a lot of young eyes watching you. You have a responsibility to be a role model to these young people. But it's also, hey, especially in this day and age now with social media as prolific as it is, you've always got eyes. A camera's always close by you here, and you've got to make sure you conduct yourself accordingly. I had a good sense for that at a pretty young age, just because I knew, hey, my last name, it means something beyond just myself, and it does for everyone. But in this case, it was something so public facing that I was pretty cognizant of how I conducted myself was always going to reflect back to Dad because of the nature of his job.
Did it seem like you were watching your dad and listening to your dad, or did it seem like you were watching and listening to your dad playing a character?
Oh, no. My dad's stock line has always been true for him as it is for me now is, hey, just be yourself because you ain't smart enough to be anybody else. And like, it's, it's self-deprecating because that's part of, the whole shtick. But no, Dad was always himself. And I think that was the coolest part was I got to share my dad with a whole bunch of other people. And I love my dad a ton. My whole family does. We've been so fortunate to have a father that away from the microphone has always poured into us. He was never someone that cared. I always say my dad's like the worst semi-famous person ever, has no idea how big the show was. He's constantly surprised when other people, actors, prominent athletes now come up to him and talk to him about how much the show meant to them. He had no idea because he's always just been my dad. He's always just been himself and has never really been concerned with being anybody else. He's the most comfortable person in his skin I've ever met. And it's always something I've been very jealous of because just the way I'm wired mentally, that's always been a lot tougher to come by for me. But he has such a natural self-confidence and assurance in who he is and what he brings to everything. There was never a character with him. What you saw on air and what you continue to see on air through 2+ decades, almost 3 decades, has been exactly who we get at home. And that's been the cool part of all this.
How was getting to watch Noah during the Olympics in those big moments? Are you nervous when you're watching him call a game in the spotlight, or are you able to sit back and enjoy it?
I'm much more nervous watching him than I am doing it myself. So I think anyone that's a parent can attest to this. You would trade places at any point of any moment if it would make your kid's life easier. That's just a perspective. And it would be no different than when Noah was in Little League or playing basketball or swimming or tennis. You feel the angst of him having to go out and and perform, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't help him. So I would equate it to that. I would say it's a little different in that I just have so much institutional knowledge of how this stuff works. And because of that, I know all of the elements of what makes for a good broadcast or what can sidetrack a broadcast in the moment. And being that aware is often not necessarily your friend, but he does not feel those levels of stress that I described. He's really comfortable doing this. It comes across that way. He is a student of this. He cares about it. He wants to do it the right way. This is not someone that's looking to cut corners. So I know the work that he puts in. I know the preparation. And then I also know the kind of person he is and how he treats others and how he finds common ground with his analysts and producers and on and on and on. And that gives you confidence as a parent when you see your kid in those situations, knowing that they are ready for it.
And that comfort level is probably one of the hardest things for some aspiring sportscasters to develop. And I think so. It's interesting that you mentioned watching your parents at a young age and the repetition and seeing them on stage. Obviously, Noah was able to watch you up close throughout your career and as he was growing up. And then there are the nepotism claims that, that Joe Buck has dealt with and Kenny Albert and Noah has now received, but that growing up in it and watching it firsthand versus just kind of getting thrown into it in college, it's impossible to duplicate or impossible to devalue.
I think it does go a long way. Obviously, if you're around it, there's a form of osmosis that seeps in. You've seen it. You know what it's about. You've witnessed it. You've seen behind the scenes. You've seen literally the camera and your father, or the microphone or headset and your father. And there is an eternal benefit from that. And then, look, there is something to be said for ability, natural ability that's in you, that's been passed down, that makes you comfortable in those situations. It doesn't mean that every kid of every broadcaster is destined to do this, and a lot of them aren't interested in doing this. And I think that's a big part of it too, at least from my perspective and for my wife. We really never told him, hey, this is something you should consider. It was always his choice, his decision to figure out what would provide happiness, because that's what we root for. I hate to break it down to the simplest form, but that's really what it is.
Yeah.
You want your kid to be happy
in
life. Try to figure out what makes you happy and then follow that path. And I know it's much more intricate than that in life. I get that. But sometimes it's as simple as that. And for Joe and for Kenny and for others, Noah included, they all determined that would make me happy. I'm gonna try that and see where it takes me.
Yeah. It seemed like it was near unanimous on social media how good Noah did during the Olympics. Everybody seemed to love it. And while I understand social media is just a small percentage of the audience, but that's usually the loudest, filled with the loudest critics. So to see the amount of people that were saying how good Noah and Dwayne Wade were doing, I think that certainly says something for the job that they did.
Yeah. And the one thing I would add, Brandon, look, all of that is a part of it, and there's no avoiding it, certainly in this day and age. When I broke in at WFAN radio, this is the early 90s, and the only feedback you were getting was from the callers, and then an occasional letter that you would get in the mail. Or then Mike and the Mad Dog came up with Fax Fridays, where people would fax in questions and they would literally read them on the air. That was it. That was it. Or media critics at the time, Phil Mushnick, who was still writing for the New York Post, Bob Raceman, writes for the Daily News. There were a few other writers in the New York area, Stan Isaacs in Newsday at the time, and eventually Richard Sandomir with the New York Times, Rudy Martzke at USA Today. That was your feedback. And what it taught me at that point that I still subscribe to today is self-criticism is still going to be number one. That's the top aspect of this. You've got to develop a real understanding of when you've done something well, or if you haven't met the mark, if it's subpar, and correct it. And that comes from watching your stuff and policing yourself in many ways of not making the same mistakes over and over. And even amidst social media, which, yes, it's huge. When that developed, it became a whole other avenue in which to get an opinion. Your toughest critic is you. Always. It always has to be you. And that's a non-negotiable.
How close were you to joining Josh Harris in buying the Commanders from Daniel Snyder? How close were you to being part of that ownership group?
That close.
Yeah.
I'm not going to lie. There were some analysts out there who kind of joked and said I created a GoFundMe account for buying the Commanders or being a part of the group. But no, I was not. It wasn't a GoFundMe. It was a real thing. It's ironic now because the reason I didn't, I did help Josh Harris raise money for buying the Commanders, not his, but bringing people to the table to join that group who are in the group. So the reason that I did not join the group, which I'm saying is funny now, it was because of the situation with Tom Brady. So, I was an analyst at ESPN, and to continue to be an analyst and be able to cover NFL teams, it would have been problematic to be in an ownership group of a team while calling games or calling or doing studio work for that team. So that's the reason I wasn't in the group. Tom Brady is now the top analyst for Fox and an owner, minority owner for the Las Vegas Raiders. But it's not something that I bat an eye at. One, it's Tom Brady. Okay, Tom Brady's the greatest quarterback of all time, and he can do whatever the hell he wants to do. But for me, I'm always going to support the team. If there's an opportunity in the future to join and be a minority owner, Josh knows that I'm 100% interested in something like that. I know Kevin Durant has talked about wanting to become a minority owner of the team. So that is certainly, I would say, a possibility. I have a great relationship with Josh Harris in the group, Magic Johnson. So we'll see, but it's not something that I'm pressing and pushing the medal for, because I want to be a broadcaster and do it to the best of my ability. And if that means not joining the Washington Commanders ownership group because I can't have access to certain things, then I'm okay with that. But if they come to me in the future, I'll certainly be ready to make that happen, because that would be a dream come true. So never going to shy away from that.
So how hard do you think it is for Brady to be calling these games without that access? Obviously that's something that you valued.
Okay. Do I value talking to the coaches, being in the building, being able to talk to the strength coach, talk to in college, you talk to the SID, in the pros, you'd be able to talk to their communication president, and get the stories that you can't find online and you can't get by word of mouth from a mom or a dad. Yes, I value that. I think it helps in storytelling. My question to you would be, do you feel like Tom Brady at this point in his NFL broadcasting career is a storyteller about the players that he's covering?
No.
Exactly. So in Tom Brady's situation, when he's more so breaking down the play, he's telling stories about his career because he's the greatest quarterback of all time. And I think people want to hear it from his perspective. I don't think it hurts him based off of what he has been doing to this point. In the future, if he becomes more of a storyteller about the players, could it hurt? Yes, it will. That will definitely limit your ability to do those things. Is he predicting plays? I haven't heard a game where Brady's predicted plays. I've heard him tell you what he would do, but I haven't heard him tell you what the other team is going to do. Because if he was doing that, yes, going to practice on Friday and you see a red zone play and then you see them line up in the same formation on game day, yes, you're going to be able to call that play out because you just watched it. So I just think for what he's doing right now, I don't think it hurts him. And he can do whatever he wants. Whatever a TV network allows you to do, that's what you can do. Get drunk on air, say cuss words on air, talk about religion in a negative way, whatever it may be. If they allow you to do it, you can do it. That's the bottom line. And that's the new age media that we live in. And it's your decision whether you think that's good or not.
So would ESPN have allowed you to become a minority owner, or were they against it?
That was not going to happen. It was that was the conversation that was had, not with ESPN. I'm never going to throw anything out there that is not factually correct. So that conversation was never approached with ESPN, but I was told unequivocally that would not happen.
Gotcha. Let's go to some current events. The 2311 front row antitrust lawsuit against NASCAR. Can you give a quick summary of what that lawsuit is, like a oversimplified shortened version just for non-racing fans like myself?
Yeah, so there's no franchises in NASCAR. When you own a NASCAR team, there's nothing that says, "Hey, I'm here forever." Like, I bought this and I'm going to be an owner until I sell it. But what NASCAR did do a few years ago, because teams were going out of business and then they would have nothing. Like if they lose their sponsor, because the sponsors is how a race car goes around the track, right? The team goes to a sponsor, they say, "Can you give me $20 million, please? And we're going to put your name on our car, and then we will hire the driver, hire the crew. We will improve our car. We'll make it go fast because of the money you gave us." And if the sponsor goes away and they can't find another one, the team's out of business. They have nothing, right? Like, except their old cars, and their race shop. So teams could, in the past, they could pour hundreds of millions of dollars into these operations. And if they go out of business, they're just done. Well, so NASCAR accommodated them by giving what they're called charters, which is a guaranteed entry into every race and a share of the TV money, right? Like a guaranteed slice of the pie. But the charters are coming up for renewal. The new deal starts January 1st of next year. And NASCAR agreed to give the teams more money than they had before, like a bigger slice of the pie, because the teams are like, "Hey, we're still losing money here. Like, we appreciate the charters, and it's nice now that they've grown to $40 million, $50 million. The top one is sold for $40 million, but they're worth more than that supposedly." And the teams are like, "Look, if NWSL Women's Soccer League franchises are selling for X amount, we think that having a NASCAR team with pretty good ratings should also be probably worth $100 million per team or whatever." So they think there's a lot more money to growth. But the problem is NASCAR doesn't want to make the charters permanent. NASCAR is saying, "We'll give you these every 7 years, then we'll renegotiate." And there's nothing to say that, it's guaranteed that this will come back, right? Like, they could take them at any time. And so two of the teams, which one is Michael Jordan's team, 2311, and Front Row Motorsports, the other team, this guy owns like tons of like Long John Silver's and Taco Bell franchises. They didn't like the terms. Well, I say none of the teams really like the terms, to be honest. But they felt kind of, they negotiated for 2 years and they finally got to this point. NASCAR said, "This is the deadline." And 13 of the team owners signed it. Well, these other two didn't. And they asked NASCAR for more. They asked them for various, like 7 different things. And NASCAR said, "No, we're not even going to talk about it." So they said, "You know what? We think you're a monopoly, because actually we can't race anywhere else. There is no alternative to racing in NASCAR in terms of the stock car series. You guys own the tracks, you own the cars that we have to run. There's no other stock car series that's a competitor, and you're controlling all these terms. So if you're not going to give us what we want, well, we're going to sue you now. We think you're a monopoly. So this is just the beginning of this trial, where they're trying to, get some concessions, and it's probably going to drag out for a couple years. I was in court yesterday, Michael Jordan sitting in the courtroom front row, right? And it's like, man, you're just staring over at Michael Jordan, and he's like leaning intently, like smirking when the defense lawyer from NASCAR is making some points he didn't like. He's just shaking his head, and you're like, man, what a surreal thing. I'm sitting in federal court with Michael Jordan over a NASCAR dispute. How did we get here? How did we get here? But
definitely could not have predicted that at the start of your career.
Yeah.
So what was the previous split, with the TV money between NASCAR and the teams, and then what was that latest proposal? Do you know the percentages?
I think it was something about it was a little bit over a third before. Now NASCAR is saying that the teams are going to get about half, but I think the teams are fine with the TV money part of it. But NASCAR is also saying stuff like they want control over the team intellectual property, so that they can, I think, sell that as part of it. So like one thing is that it seems like from the 2311 standpoint is like they're saying, well, wait, the Jordan brand, we don't really want you, NASCAR, to be able to sell, put Jordan brand on some NASCAR Crocs and sell them or whatever you're going to do. Like that's our intellectual property. Like we don't want to sign that over to you. Yeah. Right. Or like, there's a bunch of smaller issues, and NASCAR supposedly, and I think the permanent charters too is definitely a huge part of that. I don't want to gloss over that, because they're saying like, listen, how can you ask us to go get other investors from other sports? Like the Josh Harris, the Commanders owner, just invested in Joe Gibbs Racing not that long ago. Right. And then that has helped Joe Gibbs Racing prop them up, right? And there's big investors who would be willing to come in and do big things, hundreds of $millions in investment. I don't know, if they knew that the charter value is going to continue to go up and they could sell this as an asset at some point.
Right.
But if it's going to potentially go away and you're going to have this piece of paper that's worth $50 million on December 31st, but $0 on January 1st, just because NASCAR said so, that's not good. And right now that's actually the case for the teams, because NASCAR pulled those offers back from the teams that didn't sign them. Now the teams are saying, we actually do want to sign them, just without the clause that says you can't sue us. That's what they're fighting for in court right now. They're asking the judge, can you take out the clause that says you can't sue us for being a monopoly? And can you just remove that, and then we'll sign the charter deal? NASCAR is saying, actually, we don't want these guys to be chartered anymore. We don't want to do business with these guys because they've called us names. They've torn the sport down. And we also don't even want you to take out that clause out of the deal. So you're looking at like Michael Jordan has these two teams. Probably they're both worth $50 million each. He's looking at $100 million going to zero if the judge does not agree with this case. So there's pretty high stakes at the moment,
Yeah. So what is NASCAR's reasoning for saying that they won't guarantee the charters for more than 7 years?
They say that because the media rights deal is for 7 years, like with the new deal that they signed with the TV partners, they can't commit to having charters beyond that. They can only commit as long as people commit to them, is what Jim France, the CEO of NASCAR, has told the teams. The teams counter by saying, okay, well, but what about the NBA? What about the NFL? There's deals, there's media rights deals that come up for renewals or new deals all the time. You're not saying you can't be an owner anymore in the sport because we don't know how much money we're going to have. But NASCAR is really adamant that these are not franchises and that these teams do not have a say in how the sport is run. Whereas in the NFL, NBA, whatever, the commissioner works for the owners essentially, right? Like they own the league. So
yeah, no, I mean, it seems like NASCAR should be able to guarantee the concept of having charters with everybody recognizing that they can't guarantee what that dollar amount will represent before negotiating the next media rights deals.
Thanks for listening to the Awful Announcing Podcast. For the latest news spanning the sports media landscape and more, check out awfulannouncing.com and follow us at Awful Announcing.